the Director of Training and Outreach with IPMG. Welcome to today's Professional Development Workshop. We are going to be hearing from Dr. Mary Rita Weller on supporting individuals' right to sexual knowledge. Before we get started, I do want to give just a few reminders, including the fact that today's training has been approved for one Advocare external training credit. So if you are attending and are a case manager, you'll want to submit the confirmation of attendance email that you'll receive from our public relations per the Advocare instructions to receive the credit. So if for some reason you do not receive this confirmation of attendance within 2 business days from today, please contact our customer service at the email that you see on your screen. Also, within 2 business days of today's training, we will be providing a link to the training recording, the associated materials, and the question and answer session to all registrants and attendees, and you'll receive that via email. And it will also be available on our website at go2ipmg.com, and also links will be provided on our social media sites. We also appreciate and welcome all of your feedback. We will be sending a survey regarding today's workshop, and that will launch immediately after the PDW has ended. So we would appreciate if you would take a few moments to complete that survey, to tell us your thoughts and to provide suggestions on any upcoming workshop ideas that you may have. I'm very honored to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Mary Rita Weller. And Dr. Weller earned her Doctor of Education degree with a concentration in human sexuality from Widener University in Pennsylvania. She also holds a Master of Social Work degree and a Bachelor of Arts degree. She has studied at the Amsterdam University in the Netherlands, as well as at the International Multicultural Language School in Mexico. In addition to previously being an adjunct professor at Kutztown University, Dr. Weller also teaches part-time at Alvernia University's Social Work and Sociology Department in Reading, Pennsylvania, where she serves on their advisory board. Dr. Weller has an extensive background in supporting individuals with intellectual disabilities as an administrator with over 18 years of experience. She has spent the last 13 years as a therapist in private practice as well. She is a member of the National Association of Social Workers, Pennsylvania Association of Undergraduate Social Work Education, the National Association of Social Workers, American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality, and the National Association of Case Managers. It is my privilege to introduce to you today Dr. Mary Rita Weller, and with that, I will turn the presentation over to her.
Good afternoon. Well, I guess it's still good morning, everybody, and thank you for spending your part of your day. I would assume for many of you this is your lunchtime, so I'm so privileged and honored to have you attend this presentation. And I just always like to start off with, why do I think that this is important to me? And hold on, I just wanted to click that. Okay, so why do I think this is important to me? And the reason the passion I have for this topic really comes out of working with people who have disabilities, and specifically people with intellectual disability, and the lack of knowledge and rights and access that they have to having relationships overall, not just sexual relationships, but all relationships. But one of the reasons I sought further education and ended up getting my Ph.D. in human sexuality really was because of the work that I did with people with intellectual disabilities. And I always give this one little story about an individual that I worked with whose name, I'll just say it was Michael. And Michael lived in a community residence, and he grew up, to just give you a little bit of background about Michael, he grew up with his family. He was mainstreamed in education. He attended school events like all the other kids, and including his school prom. He is an individual with Down syndrome, and when he became an adult, he moved into a community residential situation. So Michael had a whole lot of knowledge and relationships with different people. So he was pretty much up on things. Now, Michael one day approached his staff and said, you know what, I have a sore on my penis. And thankfully, he felt comfortable enough to go to his staff and tell them that. And so they immediately called me, as I was the director of the agency, to say, what are we supposed to do about this? So he said, well, of course, we have to seek some medical feedback and have him checked out. So when we questioned him, like, Michael, what happened? And he explained that the reason why he believed that he ended up with this sore on his penis was because he was rubbing himself up against his carpet in his room. So essentially he was masturbating. So I got Michael's permission to talk to his mother about this because she had his funds. So I needed to talk to her in order to be able to provide support to him. I did call a local sexologist instructor in my area for feedback of what to do about the situation, and he made some recommendations of some things to buy to help Michael. So Michael gave me permission to talk to his mom, and his mom was thankful, and she said, well, I'm glad you're dealing with this problem and not me. Whatever you need to do. So she said to me, though, I think it's important for you to understand that Michael is not the cleanest guy, and I'm sure he masturbated when he was at home. And she said, but I never saw any remnants of that. So is it possible that Michael cannot ejaculate? And I said, well, gee, I don't know, but that's important information. I want to share it with the doctor. So we shared the information with the doctor, and so Michael has Down syndrome, and the doctor ran some tests to determine, you know, what his hormonal levels were, and what they found out was that his testosterone levels were extremely low. So right away he was started on hormonal replacement therapy, because the thing I learned is when your testosterone level is low, then what could happen would be he would be early onset of osteoporosis, which is pretty scary. So then the doctor took it a step further to find out, okay, why is his testosterone level so low? So they did an MRI, and what they found out was that he has a small size, like plum size cyst attached to the back of his brain, which in fact was the reason why he wasn't developing enough testosterone. So what they checked out that cyst to make sure it wasn't affecting anything, and it was okay, and it must have been there for some time. So now they were just going to watch it on an annual basis to make sure. But the story really is, he was 27 years old, and I thought to myself, if a young man like Michael didn't understand that when he was masturbating that he should ejaculate, then that was pretty scary to me, and thinking, I don't know of any other 27-year-old men that didn't have a disability that wouldn't have already known that information. So it became very apparent to me that this gentleman, along with many of the other people I supported, just didn't have the skills. They didn't have the knowledge. So this is really what set me off on this path of really seeking out to support individuals with disabilities in developing their sexual competency. So sexuality and disability, rights for sexual health, and really it comes to the simple fact that, like everyone else, individuals with disabilities are sexual beings, and that they have sexual feelings, attitudes, and they do engage in sexual behavior with or without the knowledge of other people knowing, but they do. And they're entitled to the same rights for basic and fundamental sexual health as everybody else. Now, what I try to do throughout this presentation is provide you with information that is useful and that you can take with you and develop your competency and your own sense of comfort and ease in working with people with intellectual disabilities around the whole idea of sexual knowledge. Because I think it's an area that has been taboo, considered taboo for many years. But I think as we all become smarter about these things, we understand that we're not really doing it justice for the people that we support. So just as a quick exercise that you can do with any of the people you support is to have these kind of conversations, such as this case scenario where Chris is talking to you and you're talking about dating and falling in love, and then Chris might turn around and say to you that his father's best friend has been coming to the house when no one else is there, and that he's been touching Chris in a way that's very uncomfortable, and that at this point Chris doesn't know what to do and makes you promise not to tell anyone. So this is kind of a case scenario that you can have a discussion with the individuals that you support and have that talk about, well, should you keep this secret, and why or why not, and what kinds of things could you do that would be helpful to your friend Chris. So I think that's kind of a non-threatening way to start having these conversations. Now, defining AAIDD defines sexuality as a lens of being male or female through which a person views and responds to the world. So what's interesting about this definition, it doesn't talk about physical sex. It doesn't talk about orgasms and intercourse. It talks about sexuality as an all-encompassing view and not just a linear view of physical behavior. I have another definition that I like to use as well by Eli Coleman, and this was from 2002. Eli Coleman is an American sexologist, and he's the director of program in human sexuality at the University of Minnesota. And his definition simply says, sexuality is, in the broadest sense, the psychic energy which finds physical and emotional expression in the desire for contact, warmth, tenderness, and love. Again, it encompasses many aspects of human being, not just the physical aspect. Now, in 2001, Dr. David Satcher, who at that time was the Surgeon General, and he was the Surgeon General through, his tenure was from 1998 to 2002 as the Surgeon General. He was originally brought on as the Surgeon General under Clinton's administration, and then he just kind of was, he stayed on until he was replaced by the Bush administration. But he came out with the call to action around sexuality. And his call was, we must understand that sexuality encompasses more than sexual behavior, that the many aspects of sexuality include, but not only the physical, but the mental and spiritual as well, and that sexuality is a core component of personality. So I find it interesting that the United States Surgeon General had a call to action, and his call to action had to do with sexuality. And just to put this into context for you, the very first Surgeon General call to action happened in 1964, and that was a call to action for tobacco-related health issues. So, but again, to put this back into context, this call to action for sexuality came out in 2001 under Bush's administration. And to be exact, it came out in October 2001, which I think some of you might find interesting considering, first of all, this call to action came under Bush's administration, knowing they were kind of conservative and probably wouldn't touch this information, but we have to put ourselves back at a time. this came out October 2001, and President Bush at that time was preoccupied with the recent terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers. So I think this kind of got under the radar to his administration. So it's amazing that it got out then. As a matter of fact, the most recent Surgeon General call to action that was put out has to do with opiate misuse and abuse. So each Surgeon General tends to put out at least one call of action during their tenure. But Dr. Satcher also talks about sexuality is a fundamental part of human life. So he doesn't say human life of non-disabled people, he says of everybody's human life. And you can do some more research on Dr. Satcher as well. He is now head of the Medical Institute at Morehouse College, and he's working very diligently around the military and supporting, looking at their sexual needs as well for engaged military personnel. So when we talk about sexuality, and especially when we're focusing on sexuality around issues regarding people with disabilities, especially those with cognitive disabilities, we really need to not forget about ethical dilemmas and the possibilities. And so, I mean, these are something that professionals and family and all stakeholders are constantly struggling with when we're talking about sexuality. So this is often a very difficult topic to discuss, and not only with people with disabilities, but people with non-disabled people. So essentially, when we talk about the standards that we can apply, is that it's really, there are no set standards of practice where we can say, well, this is the right way to do things and this is the correct way. Instead, it really is based on each individual situation. And we can't collectively just say, well, for instance, people with IQs of 70 are not able to consent to, people with IQs of 70 or below are not able to consent to sexual activities. That would be kind of a set standard that I think we would all agree that there are definitely individuals who have an intellectual disability that certainly do not, probably do not have the capacity to consent, have informed consent for sexual activities, whereas there's other people that certainly do. So what are the attitudes, essentially? Limited information is available, but individuals who have developmental disabilities, the data that are available indicate they are poorly informed and hold largely negative attitudes towards the expression of their sexuality. So that's saying those individuals themselves often look at sexuality as being bad, for instance. The other thing I want to call to your attention here, which I find interesting, if you see at the bottom, these are the researchers, McCabe predominantly. And Dr. McCabe and the rest of these researchers, they are out of Australia. And the reason why I point that out is because I have found through my research and looking at research in that the cutting edge and the most update, the best practices I find are coming from countries that were related to Great Britain. So you often see Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are at the forefront of best practices when it comes to this area. And an example I can even give to you about that is in 1990, when a lot of this research was coming out, they were already utilizing terminology such as intellectual disabilities, and they had gotten rid of the words mental retardation from their research. It wasn't until 2000, around 2000, that here in the United States that we actually changed the terminology from, it used to be the original journals and research was through AAMR, which is the American Association of Mental Retardation, and now they're the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, AAIDD. And the reason why I think this is important is because terminology in sexual attitudes is really at the forefront of a lot of the information that we provide to people, and using appropriate language. And then, again, researchers from Australia, they found that sexual knowledge of individuals who have developmental disabilities is often partial, inaccurate, and inconsistent. Now, the research that I'm citing tends to be like 20 years old, because when I was looking up newer research on this information, the newer research was citing all of this older research. So I thought, well, I'll just stick with this information because it's pretty consistent what's today, which tells me that there's not a whole lot of updated information being provided, a lot more research into this, any new groundbreaking work that's being done, which might be a little concerning, because does that mean this has fallen off of the radar? So why do individuals have this partial, inaccurate, and inconsistent knowledge about sexuality? And it's because of the lack of education and the lack of the same opportunities that their peers may have. So there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty amongst this population about what's acceptable behavior. So part of the information that we need to provide to people, or our understanding around sexuality, has to do with laws and who can and cannot consent to engaging in sexual behavior. So in order to engage, one thing that is consistent throughout all the states in the United States are two things in their laws around sexual abuse and sexual assault, and it has to do with informed consent and age. Who can actually consent to sex? So in order to have informed consent, you have to have these two elements. You have to have there's a duty to disclose information, and then the right to make the decision. So people can't make an informed consent until they have all the information. And to give you an example of this, a very simple example I'll use is a medical consent. So an individual finds out that they have blockage to one of their arteries, to their heart. And so their physician has to disclose to them the basic information about the diagnosis and the treatment options. So the basic information is you have a blockage to a valve due to cholesterol. And with this blockage, what may result is stroke, heart attack, possibly death. That's the diagnosis. Now, the doctor will then provide the patient with their treatment options, telling them what their risk and the benefits are. So typically, the physician would tell the patient, okay, you have 4 options. 1, you can have open heart surgery to remove the blockage. 2, you can have a stent put in to remove the blockage. 3, you can be put on medication to not remove the blockage, but maybe handle the symptoms. Or 4, do nothing at all. So those would be the different treatment options, and then the physician would be required to explain to the patient the risk and benefits to each of those options. the patient would not be able to make an informed decision unless, of course, they have all the information about the treatment options. So if the doctor only gives them partial information, for instance, the doctor says, okay, you have a blocked artery and your choices are you can have open heart surgery or do nothing, then the patient really isn't in a position to make an informed consent. And so it's the same when we're talking about people with disabilities and providing them information about sexuality. So if all we're focusing on is all the negative side effects that can occur with asexual activities, such as, well, if you have sex, you can end up with a disease or you're going to end up pregnant. That's not providing people with all the information and all the options. Because we know, yes, it is a possibility that a person can end up with a disease, and if they're a woman, end up pregnant. But we also know that there's ways to lower those risks. So we have to provide people with the right to make decisions. And the right to make decisions is having them ask to consent or refuse to treatment. And that's the case scenario that I just provided, was really giving them all the options and then allowing them to make an informed decision. And of course, when we're talking about sexual relationships, we're also talking about voluntary consent, which is essential. And the person involved should have the legal capacity to give the consent. This is where we get into the whole idea about age and mental capacity and use of drugs and so forth. So what I'm going to do next is we're going to look at specific situations where consent requirements can be altered or avoided, and then we'll go into actual differences around legal age of consent and differences in the laws. So there are a couple of situations where consent requirements are altered or avoided. So they encompass incompetence, and incompetence comes to speak of age or mental capacity or being under duress because of a drug or alcohol. The waiver alteration of consent requirements really is intentionally strict around the perspective for study rather than individual to any particular case. So waiver really doesn't apply in this situation. It's really talking about studies more so. And then, of course, we know consent may be waived during an emergency, such as a life-threatening situation. And then there's also a clause for therapeutic privilege to waive consent, and that is, let's say that a psychiatrist, for instance, has information about an individual that they think would be harmful if they disclose that to the person. So they take therapeutic privilege in not presenting that information. An example I could give of that might be something like if they knew that somebody was the result of an incestual rape situation. They may withhold that information because they may determine that providing that information to the individual will be more detrimental to their health. Okay, so now, just to demonstrate the complexity of our laws, which individuals with intellectual disabilities often are not even told about and have little knowledge. The general public often has little knowledge around this information. In Indiana, what's interesting is that the law of consent, the age of consent in Indiana is 16. And then it even goes into talking about how a person at least 18 years of age who performs or submits to sexual intercourse or deviant sexual misconduct commits sexual misconduct with a minor between 14 and 16 is guilty of a Class C felony. And the Class C felonies, there's different classes. Class A felony would be 30 years of imprisonment. Class B is 10 years imprisonment. Class C is 4 years imprisonment. And Class D is 1.5 years of imprisonment. And then it talks about how it's raised to a Class B felony if it's committed by a person at least 21 years of age. So really, when you look at this, it's very confusing, and this is why we hire lawyers to help us understand these concepts, legal concepts. And Indiana even has another clause called the No Romeo and Juliet laws, which essentially says there's no set close in age exemption. So they're saying anyone who engages in sexual activity with someone under the age of consent, which is 16, is liable for prosecution, including people only a few years older and even two individuals that are both under the age of 16. So essentially, in this situation, you can have a high school senior who has a sophomore partner in school and can be considered, or even a junior if they're under the age of if they're 16, and that can be considered a sexual offense. And again, I don't know how many high school kids know this information, never mind high school kids with disabilities. And then the Indiana Code goes into a whole spew of different sex crimes, and it breaks them down. The ones around unlawful employment near children, sex offender residency restrictions, sex offender internet offense, and inappropriate communication with the child, I think those are newer laws that are really based on the sex offenders list. And if somebody is on that list and they're working in an employment situation where they're not supposed to have any contact with children, and of course with the residency restrictions, we know the internet offense and then the inappropriate communication with children also goes back into social media as well. So I think it's interesting that Indiana has captured those areas within their sex crimes. So they have made some major changes around that, but I want to go into, I'll specifically focus on rape. I find it interesting, look at the definition of rape in Indiana, which says, a person who knowingly or intentionally has sexual intercourse with a member of the opposite sex when the other person is compelled by force and an imminent threat of force, the other person is unaware that sexual intercourse is occurring. That has to do with, I would say, if somebody is like in a coma or they're unconscious. The other person is so mentally disabled or deficit that consent to sexual intercourse cannot be given. And then that's considered a Class B felony. Now, the reason why I put in italics with a member of the opposite sex, I find it interesting that in Indiana, it is determined that it's only rape if it's between people of the opposite sex, but does not include same sex. So very heterosexist language there. But yet they did figure out how to capture the whole internet and social media thing, which is wonderful. But so, and then how they determine so mentally disabled or deficit, that's really up to interpretation. And I think that's where the folks that we support with any kind of cognitive disability, they kind of fall in that gray area. And then they go on to what they consider their Class A felony, which makes it a higher level offense. And it's with the threatening deadly force or using deadly force, serious bodily injury to the defendant, And then they talk about controlled substances and drugs that may be involved. So that really talks about if somebody's gotten a date rape or they slipped them something. And then just to give you some confusion about how different states say things. So in New York State, they go into, you know, not consenting to a sexual conduct, a weapon of force is used or threats, and their language is a person is mentally disabled, mentally incapacitated, or physically helpless, or is committed to the care and custody of the state correctional system or hospital and is under the age of 17. So their age of consent is 17. Indiana's is 16, and then their language is the mentally disabled, mentally incapacitated, or physically helpless. They also do define what lack of consent means, which includes the circumstances where the victim clearly expressed they did not consent to the act of intercourse, or by means of age, mental disability, mental incapacitation, or being physically helpless. And a reasonable person in the defendant's situation would have understood the victim's words, actions, and or conditions. Pennsylvania uses different words like forcible compulsion, a person who's unconscious and knows that the complainant is unaware that the sexual intercourse is occurring. But let's see what their language is. Where the person has substantially impaired the complainant's power. So again, this talks about drugs and so forth. But they also add in it, who suffers from a mental disability which renders the complainant incapable of consent, and who's less than 13 years of age. So then here we have a different age. So they use the term suffers from a mental disability which renders the complainant incapable of consent, which I have to say is a lot better than what they used to say. I think they used to say is an imbecile or something like that. I brought New Jersey in because of a specific situation that occurred in New Jersey that really has put a whole spin on sexual assault and offenses. So again, they break it down even more about blood and so forth. But the one slide I'm going to run through these slides because it also goes into you know, what qualifies as a sexual assault. The last slide is really the one I have on here, not this one here, this one where it says, this is something that they're proposing to put in their language. An actor is guilty of aggravated sexual assault if the actor commits an act of sexual penetration with the person the actor knew or should have known had an intellectual or developmental disability that rendered the victim incapable of understanding the right to refuse the act, including the ability to resist and exercise the right to refuse, or incapable of understanding the nature of sexual conduct, or incapable of exercising the capacity to consent when the sexual conduct occurred. And this is wonderful that they have here. This provision shall not be interpreted to deprive a person with an intellectual or developmental disability from engaging in consensual sexual activity. So what is unique about New Jersey and why they're proposing this kind of language, I think, has to do with the case that occurred in March 1989. And this is something that you can Google for yourself and you can read about. It was a horrendous situation where in Glen Ridge, New Jersey, there were 4 football players, high school football players, that invited a 17-year-old female schoolmate who had been somewhat mainstream, but she was also involved in special education classes. She actually had an IQ of 64, and the question really, they had lured her into this basement and had basically committed a sexual assault and gang rape, and using objects such as a baseball bat and a broomstick, inserting her. And the case was really intensified on both sides. On the defendant side, they were trying to use what they call, quote unquote, the Lolita defense. And what they were stating was that this girl was very sexual, she was flirtatious, she had engaged in sexual activities with other people. In this case, they actually allowed the defense to bring in her sexual history. So they were going back to some of the old language and the old theories around people with intellectual disability as being very sexualized and over-sexualized. So that was their defense. And then in her defense, I mean, they were trying to, on her side, what they were trying to do, the prosecution was trying to demonstrate that she was deficient, that she was incapable of engaging in such behavior, and that these boys really took advantage of this poor young woman. So in both sides, it really was not a very good situation, because the prosecution is trying to portray this young woman as being this kind of incapable of engaging in such activities because she's so mentally deficient. What resulted in this whole situation was that 3 out of the four players got 15 years max. They ended up serving 7 years, and the 4th kid ended up on probation. So these kinds of things are still, unfortunately, these are arguments that have yet to be settled. So now what? Well, laws of consent throughout the United States do not support the rights of individuals with cognitive disabilities to actively engage in sexual expressive behaviors. These laws were really put into place to protect individuals with any type of cognitive impairment. So somebody who's in a coma obviously cannot consent to sexual activities. Somebody who is under the influence of drug and alcohol may not be able to consent, depending on their situation. And also people with cognitive disabilities, with major head traumas or an intellectual disability, may not be in a position to consent to having sex. And that's why these laws were really put into place. But the problem with the laws is that, and the concern I have is, depending on where you live in the United States and depending on who is calling the shots, that a person's rights to sexual expression can really be denied, legally can be denied by law. So when we look at all this legal jargon, we know for adults with IDD that their understanding of legal aspects of sexual relationships is extremely limited, and that's based on a study, again, out of Australia from O'Callaghan and Murphy in 2007. So they really need our support in helping them learn about legalities and areas of consent so that they're not breaking laws, and so that they can live lives of fulfillment. But again, my concern is the way that these laws are stated. These laws really are stated to protect people from having sex or taking advantage of people. Because our laws are, in the United States, they're complex and they're piecemeal. Like I said, we have different ages of consent, we use different language, we have different meanings. And one of the things is we probably don't do enough to educate probably kids in school with and without disabilities overall about what this means. And when I think about the work that I've done with individuals with intellectual disabilities around sexuality and social relationships, I did a little bit of work around legal aspects when it came to laws of consent and what consent means, but not a whole lot. So where do people with cognitive disabilities learn about sex? Well, essentially, they're not really learning about it from their family and their friends and from common other situations. They're really learning about, because people are really fearful to have this conversation with people with intellectual disabilities. They're afraid if they talk about it, it'll be opening a Pandora's box and so forth. So they are often getting their information from popular media, TV, music, and movies, and so forth. Now, most of us, if we thought that the information on TV and through movies and popular media were accurate, we would be thinking that it's quite common for people to have sex in elevators, for people to engage in sexual activities for high mile clubs, such as in airplane bathrooms. People would be having sex on their desk at work, and so forth and so forth. Now, no doubt some of that behavior does happen, but I think in most businesses and organizations, that kind of behavior is frowned upon. That having sex, and I believe it is unlawful to engage in sexual activities in any public area, such as a public restroom. So their information is often skewed by what they see on television and thinking that may be reality. The other thing that happens is they see all these beautiful people, and that's the person they want to have a relationship with. Well, we all do, but we also understand that these beautiful people are simply part of media, not necessarily reality. So they don't have. So what happens when we don't have the sex talk? And when we don't have the sex talk with people, it conveys negative sexual messages to people with disabilities about their own sexuality. So the primary barrier to really realizing their sexual rights is, I would say, the insufficient efforts by professionals to address sexuality. And the reason why I agree with Dr. McCabe's point is the fact that people with disabilities, especially cognitive disabilities, really aren't going to be the ones to push for their rights when it comes to having their sexual needs met, because they are shamed by it and they feel that it's negative, and they need the help of professionals and family members and stakeholders to support that and push for those kinds of those rights. When I think of the change from the terminology mental retardation to intellectual developmental disabilities, I think a lot of the charge came from individuals themselves, but I think that really it was professionals that pushed the agenda and made the change from the jargon. So we don't use the word retarded when we're talking about people who have a disability, but not necessarily should we be calling it retardation. So other barriers to realizing sexual rights: negative perceptions that others have of individuals with disabilities. And the research that has demonstrated that displays of affection and sexual behaviors expressed by individuals with intellectual disability are seen as less acceptable than the same behaviors shown by persons without disabilities. And that was from a study done in 2007 from Consequently and Gilmore, again, two researchers from Australia. So again, if you're looking for some good information, best practices, you want to look at the research coming out of Australia, because they really seem to be ahead of the wave. But there is good news. Again, the same researchers did a study in Australia, and they found that the community attitudes towards sexual rights of people with ID are generally quite positive, with the exception of people over 60 years old. And that the community views about parenting by people with ID were more cautious, but they're generally more moving towards a more positive area. So why do we need to pursue sexual rights for people with disabilities? Because they're entitled to the same rights for basic, fundamental, and sexual health. And what are the other benefits? Well, again, we need to talk about the negative sides of sexuality, and that is helping to prevent unplanned pregnancies and deterring sexually transmitted infections, and also helping people express their needs appropriately and to improve social behaviors, and to also increase awareness around sexual abuse. That people with intellectual disabilities need to understand that they have a voice, and their voice is they can say yes to sexual relationships, and they also have the ability to say no. And why is that important? Because when we look at these statistics, again, these statistics are from the late 90s, early 90s, and that's because this is the only information I can find. There's not a lot of new studies being done out there. So between 68 to 83% of women with developmental disabilities will be sexually assaulted in their lifetimes, as contrasted to an estimated 18% of women generally. So with that type of statistic, when we're working with women with a developmental disability, it's you almost have to have that understanding that this person most likely, unfortunately, most likely was sexually assaulted at some point of their life, or will be. And then another study, and this I found, again, this is from 1993, but this was from the Center for Neglected and Abused Children, and this was from a study that they did in 2014. And it's still from a 1993 study, which found that children with intellectual disabilities were at twice the risk of physical and sexual abuse compared to children without disabilities. And why does that happen? Lack of training and experiences. So there are unrealistic sexual expectations, especially in the area of partner. I have seen where working with individuals, like I said, they think that they can date the movie star or that really handsome or gorgeous girl, and it's really a matter of supporting them and understanding that, you know what, you gotta meet up with people that are more like yourself. That's who we all connect with, not with this, you have to hook up with somebody who's compatible to you, not the ideal person. Sexually inappropriate behavior and deficit in social-sexual skills. And again, it's unlikely that education about the law for people with IDD is relatively uncommon. Again, people we work with don't have a whole lot of understanding around consent laws, so they might be attracted to somebody younger and not realizing that that can get them into a whole lot of trouble. And how do we do that? Well, we can do that several ways through different training modalities, including behavioral training methods, which include role-playing, decision-making training, and discussion groups. And we have to do these things repeatedly throughout their lives, not just one time or two times. I found I really enjoyed running discussion groups with people with intellectual disabilities and talking about relationships and developing relationships. And by running a group, it really even gave them a core peer group as well. And so I wanted to provide you, I didn't want to just have this discussion with you on all this information, but I also have additional information about some tools that you'll be able to access in order to do this. So caregivers need support too. So we need to validate the concerns. And when I say caregivers, I'm talking about people that work with people with intellectual disabilities, about family members, about other stakeholders. So they really have to understand what are the ethical implications. And one of the ethical implications around this is the fact that our laws nationally do not support sexual relationships for people with IDD. And so understand the needs of how to support them and ways that we can provide that support. So it's not just about the individuals that we support, but it's also providing that support to the people that work with them. So why do they need these social-sexual skills? Because without them, they're unlikely to develop meaningful and successful relationships, decreased ability to protect themselves from sexual harm, and then decreased ability to identify appropriate, safe, authority persons with appropriate language to communicate if they are sexually harmed. And I could give you a quick example of that situation. I had a young man who, let's just call him John, and his friend Bill. And he was in his mid-20s, and he had a good friend, Bill, and they'd been friends since they were kids. They both had intellectual disability, and they spent a lot of time together, and his friend Bill was sexually aggressive towards John. And John had reported this to his parents, and he had been reporting this to his parents for months, and they could not understand what he was trying to tell them. So he lived with his parents, and they understand when he speaks for the most part, but whatever language that he was using trying to explain this situation, they were not getting it. So it took them 6 months in order to realize what was going on between John and Bill before they could intervene and do something about it. And of course, they felt awful, and they had a lot of regret and a lot of guilt because he didn't have the appropriate language. They didn't understand, his parents didn't understand what he was saying. So some of the resources to help guide your discussion with stakeholders and individuals. I would say one of the best resources is this site on Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States. The acronym is SSKAAT. And there's also a SSKAAT, SIECAN for Canada. This is a website that you can get onto. They have all these free resources and lesson plans. It's mostly geared towards it's mostly geared towards children and teenagers, but you can still take their resources and tweak them and make them work for adults as well, adult learners as well. And then ETR Associates is another area, another place that provides all kinds of training tools as well. But as I said, SSKAAT and SSKAAT, those are free resources. You might have to pay something for the ETR, but I think it's moderate prices. An assessment tool is the Socio-Sexual Knowledge and Attitudes Assessment Tool, the SSKAAT-R, and that I found is a really good assessment tool. It costs about $450, but I was able to talk to the publishers and get for $350, and believe me, it's paid for itself. It's very visual. My only caution about that is you would have to really look at it and make some decisions, because some of the information could be a little risque for some of the folks. They might be uncomfortable. The Verbal Informed Sexual Consent Assessment Tool by DeMarco and Taverner, and it's only like $15, $15, $20. It's more of a tool that, it's a verbal consent tool. This SSKAAT-R is more visual for non-readers. And then you can get a hold of Life Cycle through Ivy Mont School, and then YAI does some great videos, but they're pricey. And then there's the anatomical dolls that you can get at Teach Bodies, which are fabulous. Okay, so that's everything. And then there's just, these are the references. Because I know our time is up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weller. That was very good information. And we do have a little bit of time that we can look at some questions. The first question is related to someone that is working with a young adult man with Down syndrome who has alluded that his dad is sexually abusive to him. The mother has apparently contacted the authorities, but they're not able to pursue it because he's not able to verbalize what is going on. He's started acting out. And they're asking, you know, what you would suggest in that situation where maybe someone is not able to verbalize what's going on, but it appears as though there is maybe abuse happening.
Okay, that's an excellent question, and I definitely know where they're coming from. So I have actually worked with people in similar situations, and so what you really need to do is have some real visual tools in order to help this person and understand, or try and understand, what they're talking about. So some of the tools that I used, like I got, depending on their ability, I worked with a young man in Washington, D.C. who was very, he was nonverbal, and he was doing some behaviors that was going to end up getting him put in St. Elizabeth for the rest of his life. So I found this tool through the Ivy Mont School, where it even has areas around sexual abuse, and it's all pictured guidelines. And so I was using that to kind of break down the barrier to work with him, and that's this tool called Life Cycle. And you can contact the Ivy Mont School and go through their website to maybe get a hold of that. The other thing I did was this SSKAAT-R, which is totally visual. So all you do, as long as a person can hear and they can point and they can follow direction, you can use the SSKAAT-R, where you can find out what is their basic understanding about the body and sexuality. And that's where I also use the anatomically correct dolls to also help guide my discussions so that they can point things out and show me things if they're nonverbal. So yeah, you have to use all nonverbal cues and more physical hands-on stuff. And that, like I said, the Teacher Bodies, the SSKAAT-R, and the Life Cycle helped me. It'll at least give you an idea of what their understanding is and what they're talking about or what they're not talking about. But I think in a situation like that, it's often tricky. I hope that helped.
Absolutely. Let's see. We have a question. And we do have this situation occur quite often in regards to individuals that we may be working with that have a legal guardian in place. So the question is asking if an individual is has a legal guardian in place, could that guardian prevent them from having sexual relations legally?
Excellent question. Because what I laid out for you was based on the laws of consent. The laws of consent are definitely skewed to the side of not allowing sexual relationships. So when it comes come to shove, the law is going to support non-relationship. So the only thing a person can do in that situation is really work with the guardian to find out what's their angst, what's the concern, what do they need to know in order to feel comfortable about this. Because technically, the guardian does have the control.
Very good, and we have spent quite a bit of time over the last several months on professional development webinars or workshops talking about supported decision-making and how that can be in place even if the individual has a legal guardian, working with the legal guardian and the individual in making decisions in a more supported manner. So that definitely relates to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, because you can't do anything in a vacuum. You know, you have to work with their guardians and with their families.
We have a question related to working with individuals that seem to have a specific maybe fetish related to, in this situation, diapers. So they have worked with them in encouraging them to clean those products, but the question is, should they be working towards more traditional ways of sexual expression? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that situation is, I really don't know what the situation is, so it's difficult to answer that question, but I have worked with people with philias before, and it's a matter of the least harm as long as they're not hurting themselves and helping them identify something that they can use to support their needs in a way that they're not hurting themselves. So I don't know if they're smearing feces or something like that. If that's the case, obviously that's difficult. And it's a matter of maybe finding a substitute for that.
It's very, very good information. Let's see. And I know that you have had experience, and you mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation that you had worked in a residential with a residential company that supports individuals with intellectual disabilities. And the question is asking, could such a provider of residential services tell an emancipated adult they could not engage in sexual activity in the home in which they live? So for the Medicaid waiver in Indiana, supported living situations, there may be several adults living together that are receiving services. There's direct care staff in the home providing them with support, but the individual themselves, they either own the home or they are paying rent just as anybody else would. And is it allowable for that type of provider to refuse to allow individuals to engage in sexual activity in that home? I pretty much know the answer to that, but I'll let you address that.
Well, I've known of similar situations. I mean, I know of faith-based organizations here in Pennsylvania that actually have people sign waivers when they move into the home that not only will they not engage in sexual activities, they will not even engage in any kind of partnership, like have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And they get away with it. And again, it's because we as professionals, we're the ones that really need to have these arguments to say, is that really right? But I think really depending on your state rules, the regulations, and your licensing, and the way they interpret it, it's really, and the way they allow agencies to make these kind of rules. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult. Maybe that person shouldn't live within that organization if that's the case.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just typing that information in. Someone has asked how they can obtain a copy of the references that you shared. This information, again, will be available to all who registered for today's workshop. It will also be available on IPMG's website and links provided, so you would be able to access the slides that show the references to resources, as well as some of those tools, assessment tools that Dr. Weller spoke of. So that will be available. Usually we try to get that information out within the same day, but definitely within 2 business days. So by the beginning of next week, this information will be available.
And they can also, you can also give them my email. I'm open to people emailing if they want some clarification or they want some resources, or so you can give them my email as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Again, I would like to thank Dr. Weller for taking the time to be with us today and discuss this very important topic. I'd also like to thank all of you that attended today. As I mentioned, after we close the workshop, you will be receiving a survey, so please take a few minutes to fill that out. We do appreciate and welcome your feedback. Thank you again for joining us. As a reminder, next month on May the 20th, that will be our next professional development workshop. We'll be sending out the registration information for that very soon. And a representative from Indiana Protection and Advocacy will be joining us to talk about that agency, what they're able to do in advocating and supporting individuals' rights. So that should be very interesting as well, and that will be on May the 20th, beginning at 11:30 a.m., and registration for that will start within the next couple of days. So thank you for joining us. I hope everyone has a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.